Thank you very much for inviting me. Um, I'm going to talk a little bit about turning real-world events into mega games. Although, to be perfectly honest, right at the moment, the real world doesn't seem like a very attractive place uh, to be playing games in. But I'll do my best and see if I can offer some thoughts and possibly some insights. Um, so, what real-world events? Uh, well, there's all sorts of things going on. We know this. And we already do games around conflict. In fact, as I think mentioned before, I certainly came from a long wargaming background tradition. Conflict is something that appears in pretty much all mega games anyway, but also social change, politics, technology, history. All of these things are real world events which already appear in mega games, and which we draw on for our experience. And again, we've heard already today of people who are inspired by or have used real world events as a touchstone for designing their own games, and also works of fiction. So whilst I'm going to be talking mainly about the real world, there is something about using some works of fiction as a basis which are the same sort of thing as with, say, a historical game or a game about the United Nations or a game about international politics, where that work of fiction has a deep and immersive background. And I'm thinking particularly of here of, for example, the Game of Thrones games, Everybody Dies. That was built on the back of a huge backstory, a huge deep background, and functionally indistinguishable from writing a mega game about a real world. For those in it's a very real world. So the same things, the same ideas, the same approach apply across the piece for all of these. Why bother? I mean, there's lots of sci-fi games. I've been known to write the odd game based in a science fiction environment myself. Why bother with real world events? I mean, really? Why should we? Well, first of all, it might be that it's your enthusiasm. It's something that really you're excited about. It may be something that you have, you feel strongly about. It might be, in some cases, it might be something to do with your day job. Whatever it is, when you're creating a mega game, and you're using the real world and real world events as the inspiration, enthusiasm counts for a lot, and in fact, enthusiasm counts for all mega game designs. If you're not enthusiastic, really don't go there. Real world events, the background has been written for you. There's a tremendous advantage in writing games around real world events. When I write a game based on a science fiction world, I have to spend a lot of time explaining that world. If it's a already well-known environment like Star Wars, there's still a lot of gaps you have to fill in. The real world, it's all there. It's been written for you in spades. Also, the real world has depth. The part of that background, we live in a world that has a whole lot of complexity, and as a result, it's immersive and it's believable. Well, I say that it's believable. To be honest, if you look at history or even you look at events that are going on right now, you can't make this shit up. I mean, frankly, it's not all that believable. But nevertheless, you are able to say, when somebody says, oh, but that seems a bit far-fetched, you can point them to real-world events and go, well, no, it's not that far-fetched. It's actually happened. And that can create some really good levers that go into your mega game design. So what does it mean for your mega game design? How does using this immersive background, all this additional material that you can get from the real world, what difference does that make when you're designing a mega game? Well, one thing that you have to bear in mind is that there's at least some simulation involved. By that I mean you're trying to construct mechanisms or design a game which has a real world effects, And if you don't have some element of simulation in your megagame, it's not really the real world. It's a fantasy world. And I'll talk about that in a little bit in a moment. Often we'll be using wargaming or board gaming techniques because they are quite simulationist. And in many cases, existing board game mechanisms or wargaming mechanisms can be a really good leg up when you're trying to construct a mechanism for your game. However, be careful. Not all board games and not all war games based on real world historical or present day events are necessarily all that good simulations. You need to be critical and you need to be analytical. I'll talk about that in a minute. There are also greater challenges in balancing playability. Lots of real world roles, lots of the real world is dull. It's boring. And participants in real world events are often powerless. So remember, in constructing your game, not to include roles for people who are powerless. They might have been present in history or they might be present now, but would anybody really enjoy playing them? And so balancing out playability is important. The other thing, I'm sorry to say, if you really want to try to reflect real world events, if you really want to get real, I'm afraid it does require reading and research usually. Sorry about that, but I'm afraid that's how it goes. And I was pleased to see this in Kieran's presentation, but I agree with him. We really must KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. Megagames really must be simple. If it's not simple and memorable and easy to process, then you run the risk of replacing agency with process. This is not really specifically to real world megagames. This is true across the piece. If you have a long, complicated process, you're denying your players a degree of agency because they are spending their time processing, not playing and interacting. So also, and this is a piece that I think runs across anything where you're trying to replicate a story or a background or a series of events that you have been inspired by, is you have a bit of a duty to the history and background. And this means research. I mentioned that just now. And I hate to say this, but that means reading stuff. Chances are, if you've got a real world scenario in mind, you've already read quite a lot. You've already been interested enough to read into it. But do read into that stuff and do justice to your subject as far as you can. The world is fantastic at the moment. The internet is a collection of everything that's ever been written ever, one way or another. There's no excuse for not finding books on things, and there's no excuse for doing a lot of in-depth research. Now, I'm not saying become an academic. I'm not saying you do a doctorate on this, but it really pays off to understand your subject. Analysis. So having done your research, having looked at the Wikipedia page and watched a YouTube video, analysis is where you look at what is really important. What of all the things I've learnt about this particular subject, Albigensian heretics, whatever it is, what's the important part that I've taken from that? What matters? What are the key points? Where are the crunch points? And then you move on to synthesis, which is, well, what are the important bits that I really, really need to include? And you have to be quite strict. You have to remember that you can't do everything. So do I really need to include all of the little details that I've read about? Do I need to have every little incident that has occurred in the books I've read or in the stories I've listened to? And if I do, am I really sure? Test yourself. And this is also will come up in playtesting. People will tell you if it doesn't seem like what they're doing is relevant. Much of this applies to almost any megagame design. However, in real world event type games, reality trumps rules. Whatever mechanism you've written, whatever rule system you've got, if you want your participants to willingly suspend their disbelief and populate and inhabit your world, your game world, reality must trump rules. Real life is messy, complex, and unpredictable. Real world games can reflect that, and it's a function very much of your control team, and ensuring that you've got a good control team is important. That allows you to flex. And megagames, it's been observed many times, megagames are above all flexible, that the rules do not completely bound player activity and emerging gameplay. Flexibility is the key, and a good control team allows you to make that flexibility happen. And so it is with anything that's related to the real world. There's a key element here, which is subject matter experts. Now, not everybody is going to have access to your subject matter expert. You're not necessarily going to have people helping you design the game who are academics or who are steeped in some subject professionally. But if you do, that's a real plus. That said, they might not necessarily be your control team, but they're certainly people that you would want to use to inform your game and to help you with making the game as believable and as real world as possible. However, watch out for pedants. They can quickly derail the game with paperclip counting and minor details, and that really is an issue that can be important. So the whole question of how to use experts is possibly a longer subject, but one that you need to have in mind. So, playability versus reality. We all know about this. It's a big ticket item. How much detail can you put into your game and it still be playable? I remember being very proud of a war game I wrote a long time ago, which had a fantastic World War II combat system involving a logarithmic combat results table. And I remember being dead chuffed that I'd done the maths for all this. Utterly unplayable. So learn this. There is a spectrum of playability and simulation. The more simulationist you are, not always, but often, you will get you'll have to give up a bit of playability. So you really do slide that scale up and down. And in a real world game, a game simulating real world events, you might go down the playability scale and be more open and accessible to players, have more players. And that's a good thing. You go down the simulationist end of the perspective, and you run the risk of losing players who maybe don't have as deep an obsessive interest in the subject that you do. Two ends of the spectrum. Chess is a playable game, but it's not a simulation of anything. Your playability versus reality spectrum is audience specific. If you've got an audience made up of rivet counters and tank nerds, a game with lots of detail about tanks is fantastic. If your audience is a general audience of new players to games, you definitely don't want to go down that route. So your audience is really important to understand. And if you don't understand your audience, don't know who you're going to get, err on the side of openness and inclusion and make the playability a slightly higher priority. You need to be audience sensitive. And this is an issue around historical games, particularly. Agency, relevance, the expectations of the audience are all things that need to be taken into account. Just because something exists historically doesn't mean to say it has to play into the game. And that's also around inclusivity and materials that are appropriate to your audience. So, and I'll come on to that again in a moment. And apply the so what test. So you've got lots of details you may or may not want to include, but there's a question about whether it matters. So you've added a mechanism that simulates mule breeding in northern Canada. Does it matter to your game? Well, it might if your game is about turn of the century mining teams, but not necessarily if it's about the operation of the Canadian Mounted Police. I don't know. Does it matter? It's a question you need to ask yourself constantly in pretty much all your megagame designs. So I offer the ludic challenge in conclusion. How do you avoid your real world megagame becoming a mere game? And by mere game, I mean a game which is, whilst it might be entertaining and enjoyable, has no element of simulation in it, or very little. So Ludo is a mere game. Chess is a mere game. And my first point is, not everything is a megagame. Really, I'll say it again. Not everything is a megagame. And think hard about whether the game you want to play fits the format that we are very familiar with. I'll leave that with you to think about. My other hobby horse is cool ideas for mechanisms are not cool if they don't simulate anything. So you might say, well, simulating anti-tank missile fire using darts and a dartboard, that's a really cool idea. We can do that. You know, if you get a bullseye, you've hit the turret, whatever. However, that's not a simulation of how anti-tank missiles work. It never will be. Also, there's an interesting thing around these cool ideas for me, and that is that any game mechanism involving physical skills or coordination are not inclusive. Anybody who turns up to a game who perhaps has difficulty with coordination or has difficulty with vision is expected to compete with somebody who is not so affected, is going to be disadvantaged for no other reason than the mechanism that's been created. That's not a good thing. So coming back to my point about being sensitive to your audience and your participants, think about how your mechanisms will play out with a range of people. It's a little bit of an aside, but it's important to me. Stay focused on the purpose of the game. What did you want this game to be? Avoid mission creep. Avoid moving into areas that you don't really want to go or get drawn into sidebar parts of the game. Keep it simple, keep it to point, do the minimum you need to do in order to simulate the real world event that you are interested in. And if you can't manage the reality, do fantasy. It's okay. If you can't really get a game that you think is going to be fun, that's you know, really detailed and complicated, and you find you're doing your head in, reskin it. Add some fantasy, add some imagination, make it sci-fi. I love sci-fi for doing that sort of thing. You don't have to suffer necessarily. You can play with it, because ultimately it's all about play. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much, Jim. I think you've given everyone a lot to think about when designing the games, and if we can have another round of applause in the general chat, that would be great. And people start sending questions now, that would also be good. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Okay, first question coming in from Rebecca, and she asks that the world right now is kind of mental. I think we can all agree. Can you give some current events that may well make or spark a mega game that you yourself would like to play?
Blimey. On the whole, I don't like to play mega games on subjects that have affected me emotionally or personally very much. I tend to like to deal with those. So it's a difficult one. So right now, I wouldn't feel like doing a mega game on either Brexit or the pandemic. There are lots of things going on in the world at the moment, though, and lots of tensions, and there's lots of points of concern and lots of interesting stuff. There's a load of things happening around in the South China Sea, which actually make quite an interesting mega game to play. There's quite a lot going on in space at the moment, which would be quite interesting. So there's all sorts of, I mean, there are probably more ideas than there could possibly be time to do mega games on, to be honest. It'd be great to play some mega games, though. I'd quite like that.
Yeah, I do think it's quite a fine line between sort of some of the things going on and making sure that you're being sort of civil with everybody when you're designing games at the moment. So, second question from Johan, which I guess it kind of follows on quite nicely, is how do you design for erratic or disruptive events like within your mega games? And he's got an example. If we had a Trump-like world leader being elected mid-game, or again the whole pandemic situation.
So you mean basically the events in every mega game ever?
Yes. How can you design to get those to deal with those?
I don't know that anyone needs to design for erratic or disruptive behavior in mega games. I think almost the issue the other way around is how do you manage the erratic and disruptive behavior of the participants? But to answer the question, the key issue with designing anything is what impact does it have on the game and the players? So I would avoid programming into the design disruption unless I was confident that it would generate something useful for the player experience. And so if I were doing a simulation of politics in America post Trump, that would be, if you like, one could do something, say, about the outcome of the 2016 election. In a sense, the disruptive event is the background to the game design. So your players would be interacting around, well, this has happened. What do we do about it? That would be your game structure. That would be your framework. I could go on, but on space for other questions.
No, that's great. No, we've got a lot of questions coming in. So one from Ed Silverstone, which is in relation to your talk, really, is so to what extent do mega games have an obligation to educate or at least avoid misinforming?
Yeah, obligation's a difficult one. I mean, most people are doing this for a laugh and for fun. Now that said, I do design mega games and run mega games professionally, and in that context, I have a obligation to at my duty to history point. So if I'm doing a game about a historical event and my audience want to learn about that historical event, then I absolutely have a duty to present that in the clearest way I can, and if need be, to explain where my game is fudging or is blurring the edges of reality in order for gameplay. Some of it is transparency. So I might very well say, look, this is how we're running this game. We've ignored logistics, air power, and morale because very good things to avoid. But it's the transparency thing. If the participants understand the limits of the game that you have designed or presenting for them, and that those are limits, I think you've kind of met that obligation to a degree. And the rest, any misinformation that remains, you have to take responsibility for. If you've made a mistake, own it. That's the other issue.
Right, great. Yes, I might have to start picking and choosing these questions now, man, guys. So Rob Grayson asks, how do you produce a game to brief? How much input do you take from a client? So I guess this is referring to your work with your own company. And do you work with them through the process? Or do you create games which they then choose to use?
Both. Where I produce a game to a brief, there's generally a long consultation process, and you have to work with them because they've got to feel that if somebody wants a game in a professional context, they have a particular question or a particular output that they are looking to explore or an area they want to get insight on. So you have to work closely with them. It's like any consultancy task. If you were designing a computer program for somebody, you would want to make sure you were producing what they needed, which may not always be what they asked for. Next.
Sorry, was that everything with that one?
That's it. That's all I've got. That's all I've got.
Okay. So a question from Ben. Do historic games give an advantage to players who do more research on the topic? And if so, is that something you need to factor in?
Yes and no. I've got lots of examples of people who thoroughly steeped in the history and the research who've been utterly useless at playing the game. And the reason for that is that they come to it with too many preconceptions. So it is an issue for design and for factoring in to ensure that players who maybe are not steeped in a historical period don't make unrealistic mistakes. And that's where the briefing and control team help to support people to give them effectively decision support so that they are not making dumb schoolboy errors when they shouldn't be. Leave them room to make dumb errors if they're supposed to make those errors, but I've found in practice that a deep knowledge of the history has not, generally speaking, been a massive advantage, and often a disadvantage.
Yeah, I think that's quite good, just to leave it up to the players and how much enjoyment they're going to get from the historical setting, because I know personally I normally try and do a lot of research into whatever the historical setting is for different mega games, and that just means I enjoy them more, but I don't necessarily take advantage of that as a player. And I'm just going to keep this as the last question, just so we have enough time for everyone else. When looking for real world events, what are easy red flags for something to avoid as a setting? So what do you think we shouldn't be making mega games about?
This is a question that's come up in the past. So are there any subjects that are unplayable? I think there are issues around areas of abuse, human rights, things like genocides, things like that, which are both sensitive and horrific. You might not choose to game those. I wouldn't choose to game those. So there's a question one's personal moral compass, I guess, involved in that. But I would say that the issues around that are what are you going to trigger? You might say, well, I want to do a game about setting up a death camp. It's an administrative game. It's all about, organizing trains and such like. Well, you might do a game on that. It's something you could write. And in fact, somebody did that as a political statement at one point. But that would be quite poor taste for most people, and it would have, So I think there are things, and I think you could probably, with a bit of thought, you could probably come up with a list of things that really you wouldn't want to see as games yourself.
Yeah, definitely. And just a last quick one before we leave. Is there any chance you will post your logarithmic combat system, just so that we can give it to Seamus?
Yeah, we could take that offline.
Okay, right, you heard it here first, folks. Right, but thank you very much, Jim. It's been a pleasure to have you here, and
my pleasure. Great.